Alright everyone, welcome to JTC. My name's Kaminski and today we're going to look at the track I've written for Jam of the Month October, which is kind of like a synth wavy vibe that's going on. So I'm going to show you what I came up with in the Logic session, how I sort of stacked together synths and drum samples, and how I wanted to create a cool sort of bed that you can use to write your own cool solos. So best of luck if you're having a go at this track. Let's dive right in. So if you haven't heard the track yet, you can grab it with the link in the description below. It's got the full track as well as a PDF guide that has a few different notes in there that you can check out for just a bit of tips and tricks that you can use over the track. But here we go. This is what the track sounds like. Alright, cool. So obvious synthwave vibe going on here, but let's break it down. On the surface, it looks pretty simple, and its core is pretty simple as well. But if I expand the drums, you'll see that I've done something I don't usually do, and I've actually made them using audio files in the main mix window of Logic rather than using like a sample library. Years and years ago, I found on YouTube someone who'd made these 80s drum samples and they'd put in a zip file in the description for free. And I really tried to find that video today and I really struggled to find it. But at the end of the day, these samples are quite basic. You'd be able to find them on a lot of DAWs in drum machines, and they're all taken from iconic drum machines as well. This is how the drums sound on their own anyway. I've popped the intro in here as well because I've wanted a global EQ on the drums and these two synths. And for this session, it just made sense to chuck them all into one track stack and apply a EQ with some automation on that track stack. If that doesn't make sense to you, then very quickly, I am applying this EQ to every single instrument in this stack here. And you can see the stack called drums. So if I get rid of my automation, if you have a look at this, when I expand this stack, you can see basically like a folder in Finder or in Windows Explorer. You can have a look at things like this and stack them together, basically like a folder for tracks. So I can affect just these tracks here, which is fun. So if you watch this, you'll see that I've got some automation going on here. Cool. So the main drum groove. All right, let's have a look at it. So what we've got here is a basic loop, because at the end of the day, it's synthwave and I'm not going crazy. If we just take a listen to maybe this section. All right, so what you're hearing there is a kick, a snare, two hi-hats, and a shaker. So the kick first on its own sounds like this. And if I remove these plugins here, this is just trimming some volume, so I'm going to leave that on. First thing I did is I chucked it through the Oxide tape recorder, which adds a lot of fatness in the subs and a little bit of brightness on the like papery attack of the kick. So without it, it sounds like this. And then with it, it sounds like this. You're hearing how much warmth it adds to that like 50, 60 hertz range. If you can't hear that, chuck on some headphones. It'll make it a lot easier. Or listen to this through some big speakers. After that is a little bit of basic EQ. Just trimming away some of the fat around 200 and 500 especially. And there was a lot of like that super high, almost like a hi-hat kind of sound in the kick sample, which I was not about clearly when I mix this. So if I take that away, so you can kind of hear it's going a lot darker because I have a lot of that high-end information, especially in the snare and, of course, the hi-hats and the shaker. So last thing we've got to do is compress the kick, which is Smash and Grab by GGD. I love this plugin. Without it, it's been sounding how it's already sounded, so... So yeah, your basic style of compression on a kick drum. Just the one thing to keep note of is the mix is about 70% rather than 100%. So that's the kick. The snare is Again, another sample from that sample pack, but you'd be able to find something similar on your DAW of choice in a drum machine, I'm sure. Again, going through the oxide, so without it, it sounds like this. And then with it, so you can definitely hear it's adding a lot of brightness and a little bit of fatness around 200 Hertz on that signal. So again, I've just added some EQ, so without it, it sounds like this. You can hear how much fatness that adds and how much it actually needed. Before that EQ's engaged, you could probably get away with using that sound in the mix, but I feel when you hear it in context without that EQ, you're really losing the body of the snare. When the bass synths and even the middle register synths are getting up in there, you're starting to lose the fatness of the snare. So this move really helps. As well as pushing some high mids, it really pushes it forward into the center of the mix, which is what it should be in my opinion. With the snare, we've got some smash and grab again, and without it, it sounds like this. I mean, massive difference. Just sounds way more polished and compressed, of course. That's just the sound I like in snares. Bit of saturation here, tape saturation on the plugin, and finally, you'll notice it's quite pokey. So I've used Transient Master and I've trimmed some of the attack. And what will happen is you'll probably be drawn to the more pokey sound because our ears as humans just like compression sounds. But I find when you put it all in and you put it through the instrument bus, you really hear how much that initial transient sticks out of the mix and then it gets caught. So I'm talking about like those initial 5 to 10 milliseconds of the snare transient. So by reducing this, we round that off and it sounds way, way nicer in my opinion. So here it is without. Very subtle difference, but the key thing you're listening for is that very first 5 to 10 milliseconds of the snare, like the real spike. You can kind of see it, like the initial hit, not the decay. It's not changing anything about the decay. I didn't talk about the toms before, but I will very quickly. Again, it's just samples from the same sort of pack, real classic 80s toms. So if I solo these and I'll play this fill, you'll know exactly what I'm on about. I mean, you can't argue with that sound. All I'm doing for all three of these toms is the same tape machine. And it's just going straight through the preset toms on Smash and Grab. Doing about, let's have a look. It's a good amount of compression, about 7 to 10 dB in reduction there. Let's have a look at the floor tom. Yeah. So if I play that without these things on, way more muted and a bit dark, to be honest. So with this stuff on, it sounds like this. Especially the second and the floor tom as well, they sound great. The hi-hats are even more simple. They're basically just all going through oxide again. I went with 2 hi-hats here. I could have gone for 1, because I could have kept the drum part like this. And it sounds cool, right? But I feel like it wasn't driving the track forward enough and pushing. So I added in a second hi-hat and you'll hear the difference. The first hi-hat is just quavers or eighth notes. And the second hi-hat is offbeat quavers or eighth notes. So if we have a listen with only one hat and just the drums, it sounds like this. Not a bad sound, very synthwavy. Second hat, it's a different sample, so that's an important thing to remember. It's actually a little bit of a quieter sample as well. You'll notice it's a couple dB quieter. So this is what it sounds like with the second sample. just has a lot more driving energy, which in this track I really wanted. And the third hat, I've called it a hat, it's really a shaker. It's playing more of a musical rhythm here, rather than just, on the clock, as it were. But we've got some things here going on with the shaker. Kind of hard to hear with all the fill going on, so if you listen to this part here, sounds pretty weird on its own right, but if I put it in with everything else, and again, these three just being treated very similarly. Overheads on smash mode this time. The mix is way down on all of these hi-hats, and they're basically all going through the same thing with the oxide tape machine. Again, pushing everything through the oxide adds fatness and a little bit of high end when you have these two engaged in the up positions, which is what I really like. I love oxide as a tape. And you will soon see on the instrument bus, or in this case, master bus, I'm using a different tape machine. So that's the drums. The only thing I didn't talk about was the crash, and that is even more simple. It's just a classic crash drum machine sound, and same stuff, barely touching any reduction on that. And once again, through the oxide tape machine. So let's have a look at the synths. There's a lot of layers going on here, and we will break it down very quickly. So I mentioned the intro before. It's basically the same part as what is going on here. So if I play you this main synth, and this is where this whole idea came from. I was just playing around. I was looking through Analog Lab, and I found this sound, which just made me think of Stranger Things and kind of inspired me to just put this whole track together, because I know that the last time I wrote a synthwave track, people really enjoyed it, which was Upside Down. That's quite a while ago now, but that was really fun to put together. So I thought it was time to revisit the whole synthwave thing for Jam of the Month, and this is what inspired me to do that. And isn't that just like a great sound? Nothing crazy going on in the MIDI. Literally all just 80 velocity written in with a pencil. But the magic happens in Analog Lab. So it's literally just this preset, Carpenter Brass. Change nothing about it. So lovely sound. Basically it is synthwave and Strange Things. And the only change I made was two things. It's going to a sidechain compression. I will talk about it for this synth, but just know that I've applied it to every single track in this mix going forward. And what it is every single time the kick drum gets hit, it is pushing this synth down in volume. So it's kind of like a volume automation rider in a way. So if you watch this needle, every single time the kick gets hit, this synth will get reduced in volume and pump back up to the original volume that it was. But what you get is this effect that the kick is so fat, it's kind of pushing the synths out of the way. Super common technique, not breaking any new ground here, but I just thought it was worth explaining. So it sounds like this. And without the sidechain, you see you're just not getting that energy in the movement. Both things are there, but they're not really interacting with each other. So I feel like with this, you can just hear that pumping, which is what I was going for. And the last thing was putting it through this tape echo from UA. And this thing is absolutely great. So if I take the kick out again, if you just listen to what the tape echo is doing, I've just put it on wet solo. So all you're going to hear now is what this plugin is doing. You're not going to hear the original sound anymore. There's just so much vibe with that, right? You know, you've got the delays in the left ear and you've got your reverb in the right ear. So you can see reverb pan all the way to the right, echo pan all the way to the left. And then with it in the mix, and then let's just remove it for fun. Way less vibe. Exact same thing here, but it's just an octave lower. So in the intro, it's just that, it's synth. But when the whole thing comes in, basically copy pasted the whole thing and put it in an octave lower. All right. And key thing to note here is there's no tape delay on that lower one. It was just getting way too muddy. So let's just hear those two synths with... So it's a really good foundation. That's where this track basically started. And then I went about building out the sound. And the obvious next thing I needed was the classic synthwave bass line, which goes like this. And it's a really cool bass line. There's not much you can do with it if you want to stay true to what I guess everyone does with the synthwave thing. And that is, it's playing 16th notes, but you miss out the pulse. So you have 3. So I'll just show you the piano roll. So what you do is you have, like I would say, 16th notes, but yeah, you literally just take out the pulse. So you're left with 3 notes, kind of filling in the gaps, right? So without anything, it sounds like this. And without that top synth, the 1B on the Moog, it sounds like this. So just keep note that I did a little bit of automation here, kind of playing around with the cut-off frequency and the filter emphasis. Cool. So that is a classic Moog sound. Of course, I was going to use a Moog for all the basses in this track. The 1B sounds like this. So what I did with 1B is I put it up an octave, but I also played around a bit more with the cutoff frequency and the ADSR, not only of the filter, but of the amp itself. And you get a lot more attack from this top bass rather than all of the sub was handled by the first one. So the first one again on its own sounds like this. And then together they sound like this. And I know what you're thinking, you're hearing one where that first note is of the synth, but let me put this drum group in and you'll hear exactly what I mean. So here we go. Just an amazing sound. Again, a little bit of EQ, not doing too much on both of these, pushing more of the subs, cutting a little bit of the fluff around 200 hertz. And again, yeah, just through that same side chain and just pushing them back, even though they're not playing on the kick, it just, that little bit of the tail of the release gets caught. So onto the Moog 2s, which there is a left and a right. Anyone who knows Moogs will know the like classic sound of the filter and the contour and the filter emphasis. So very quickly, it sounds like this. And this UA plugin is such a faithful recreation of the Mini Moog. And again, these are just playing notes, just one. And the cool thing is I'm not touching anything on these. You just have to set the filter emphasis at the exact right point, because if you push this too much, right? If you go over like way too much, so you got to really get that sweet spot, because if you don't have enough, you're not even going to hear that sort of sweep through the EQ. Cool sound, right? But I was going for that really nice sort of phaser effect where the EQs are kind of washing down every single note. All right, so the other one's doing the same thing. It's just an octave higher. And they're basically playing for the whole thing. Then we get to the chorus, I'll call it. And what we have here is 2 basic melody lines that I wanted to get in there because I wanted the chorus to go a little bit bigger than what we've got so far, but not so much that it was distracting from what any of you guys were playing. So here they are. They play in harmony in thirds for the most part. And this is another great Analog Lab sound, and that is Bend Me, and it sounds like this. And I don't know why, but it just reminds me of Cars by Gary Newman. And the second melody is the same patch. Everything is the same. It's just a little bit higher. And together, they sound great. And in context, we get this really nice transition that's actually rhythmically matched to the tom fill, which is something I was really conscious of. I wanted to create this kind of musical unity to lead into the next section. So any of you doing a solo over this, we're like, right, the chorus is coming now. Here is this fill. Here's where 1 is, and I know where 1 is going to be in the next bar. Really clear, really simple, but it just works as effectively as possible, right? So if we were to do that without these melody layers, you still get the overall vibe, but you're not getting that uplift when you finally change the root note, because we've been riding on this A the whole time, right? And then we finally changed to a different chord. I wanted to add in another like textural element with these high up synths. They're quite zippy, right? Just doesn't have that same lift up, which I'm trying to do because I want you to all feel like you want to take it to somewhere else, you know, like step up a gear, really let yourself shine in a way. And finally, there's real basic post-prod here. Very simple riser. An X crash. And it's as simple as that, and that's the whole track. A few synths, drum groove, and a very minimal amount of post-production. Cool, so let's have a look at the mastering chain of plugins, and Flatline is here, and that's going to make everything a lot louder. That's just needed to happen with any master that you might be working on, but when we get there, try and ignore the fact that you're just going to like it because it's getting louder. But before that, I'll show you exactly what's going on. So without it, it sounds like this, and we'll go from the intro, we'll just play a little bit of the groove. So initially we're going straight through the Studer A800 tape. I'm hitting this pretty hard actually. And I've got it on 15 IPS, and I think this is basically the default that it loads up as. But I'll show you if we just skip the intro now and go straight to the groove. And again, with tape machines, the difference is always pretty subtle, but just listen out. It's going to add a little bit of low-end harmonic warmth because I am pushing this tape quite hard, and you can see with the needle, we're getting to the point where you start getting tape saturation into the signal that's really audible, but we're just before that point. So if I take this out, you'll hear that the low end sort of like comes alive. into my favorite bus compressor at the moment, which is the API 2500. So without, it sounds like this. And with, it sounds like this, and then we'll jump through the settings really quick. So we're not doing too much here, and the mix is only around 80%. But I've got it set to 3 millisecond tack, which is fairly typical. I like super fast tack. 3-to-1 ratio. You could do 4 for sure. I know a lot of people like 4-to-1 on mixed bus compressors. For this, it's just on 3. And then the release is just 100 milliseconds or 0.1 seconds. You don't need to worry about this. And I like the knee on medium or hard, depends on the kind of music I'm doing. For more of my typical prog stuff, I'd have it on this, but for this track, it was on medium. The thrust, I always have on medium. I like the tone of that the most. Loud has got way too much of a pumping thing, and normal is probably the most transparent compression out of this compressor. But I just like medium. It's kind of a nice little happy balance. The link is set to completely independent, so if a massive crash or something went off in the right, then it'll only compress the right. Same with the left. So that's just helpful. You might not always want it. You might want a little bit, but I just like to compress that way on a bus compressor. And then the filter I've got here as well, which rounds off some of the lows, and they're not getting compressed as much. Next up is some EQ, and this thing is great. It took a while to get used to using EQ like this, and you'll hear the difference is kind of huge. There's a little bit of a volume boost again, but what I want you to try and do is listen to the mids. Like the mids are getting lifted out and pushed way more. And what I mean by mids is listen to those more boxy frequencies. So the middle synths and the weight of the snare drum, and even like the boxiness of the snare drum is actually getting pushed up. And a little bit of subs and a lot of highs at 12.5K. So this is without, and then I'll put it in. Cool. And then the next thing is just a little bit of graphic EQ, and this is Logic stock from the Vintage collection. Really, really cool collection of EQs. If you only really use stock plugins and you have Logic, you have got to check out these Vintage EQs, because the Pultec emulation is great, and so is the Neve. But this one is amazing as well, because you can kind of tune it. I just usually leave it at 0 because I like having 8 and 16K, which is what I've boosted here. I've done 0.4 and 1.1, and that is basically just the top of your hi-hats and the cymbals, and maybe some of the like hair on the synths, but not much else, and just a little cut at 125. It was just a bit too much build up with those lifts that I'd done from the other moves, which I probably should have corrected before I got to this point, but that's mixing. So here we go, without, and then I'll put it in. Yeah, so just removing a little bit of that low end, that's probably what you can hear most in that move. Headphone users beware, this is about to get a little bit louder. The track is already quite loud anyway, but we're about to go to commercial volume now. And what I'm looking for is the LUFS meter. I'm looking for about -8, -7 if I want to push it. Depending on what I did when I mix this, it should be around there. So without, of course, it's going to be a lot quieter. Then I'm going to turn it on, and then it's going to go a lot louder. And that's the version that you're hearing in the download for this month's Jam of the Month. So I hope you all enjoyed me just quickly breaking down my thought process and my mixing process behind a synthwave kind of track, which I know is a bit unusual for my kind of music, but it was super fun. I always love writing music that isn't my usual go-to. So if you are entering this month's Jam of the Month, best of luck. I know you're going to be great. I can't wait to see all your entries. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this video by just playing the entire song with the Logic view, because that's always really fun. But until next time, guys, I'll see you in a bit.